Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you don't know me, my name is Julia Chen, and I am the Activities Director at the Yale Club. And I'm so excited that all of you are joining us for our virtual lecture series, where we're bringing in live speakers for a lecture and Q&A that you can participate in from your homes. So today we are excited to welcome Tracy Campbell, who is a professor of American history at the University of Kentucky, who specializes in the 20th century United States political and social history. His new book, titled The Year of Peril, America in 1942, is set to be published next Tuesday through the Yale University Press and is available for purchase through the link that I will put in the chat. It is a fascinating chronicle of how the character of American society revealed itself under the duress of the World War II. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Julia. It's a little eerie, quite frankly, to be publishing a book about the year of peril right now. I started this book thinking about it in the middle of the financial crisis in 2008, thinking, what does a society go through? What does it feel like to live through those moments of crisis? I think they are as revealing as anything. And so the functioning premise of the book is pretty simple: to see a person or a basketball team or a society, you put it under its greatest stress and you can really see it in a way unlike anything else. And I remember writing, I finished the book in early January. It's when the final galleys went out. And I remember writing something about readers might not recognize some of the things they're going to see and read, like stores saying, don't buy too much, buy only what you need. Don't hoard what you buy here today, keep enough for everyone else. And I thought, who's going to recognize this period? But that's why it's been a unique experience to see this book coming out at this moment. So what we thought we'd do tonight is, rather than hear me talk, I'd like to take you through just some of the aspects of the book that I'd like to talk with you about tonight that I hope are relevant, that are going to be shown through a series of images that I've got here on the screen. So some are in the book, some are not, but I think they each tell an interesting story, hopefully one that you're not maybe used to. So the first image, if you can see it, it's taken in Long Beach, California in the middle of 1942. All the images are from 1942. And it's of workers standing outside a factory, an airplane factory at an outdoor assembly. And for some reason, this photo just really struck me as part of the story, our collective memory of 1942, which is that we came together in a way that we have never done before or since, that we're all bound together in a righteous cause to overcome a horrific threat coming from various parts of the world. And moments like this, I think, show the country to be as united as we'd like to think it was. One of the things I did was I read a number of newspapers, particularly the New York Times, and I went through every single day of the year, every page as the year developed, to try and get a sense of the rhythm of the year, of the internal dynamics of the year, to really feel what it was like to be in the midst of that stress and that trauma. And I think it's a lot more complicated than the usual image of us all coming together. I think the fissures that were underneath the surface really erupted in a lot of ways. They tend to do that, as we can see today in moments like this. So this might be one image that comes to mind. The next one might not be, which is school children in Connecticut saluting the flag, the Pledge of Allegiance, which was officially came to being in 1942. The official way to honor the flag actually was to raise your right hand, like these school children in Connecticut were doing. A few months later, when it was obvious that this resembled too much the Nazi salute, we changed it so that it would become simply the hand over, the right hand over the heart. This is another image that I thought would be crucial to see, that as much as face masks are prized today, rubber became really the crisis commodity in 1942. Without rubber, you can't fight a war. And that was really one of the consequences of Pearl Harbor, was not having enough rubber. And so everyone played a role in trying to keep rubber under some kind of control, whether it was make sure your tires are brought in like this young boy's doing, and over on the side, America needs your scrap rubber. So I wanted to show this image for those who might still, who were around in 1942, people I talked to who were children, remember these kinds of moments where everybody in some way could play a role in this effort. But I wanted to show you a couple of images that you might not be familiar with. And to me, these images relate the notion of fear, unlike anything else, because we tend to think of the war as one in which victory was inevitable, in which no matter what happened, we were going to be okay. That's not how we felt in the early months of 1942. To me, this is one of the best pictures. I couldn't use it in the book, but to me, this is a photo about what fear looks like. I don't know if you can make it out too well. This is from the this is from the Library of Congress. This is an image from Stevensville, Montana. And if you can make out the little building on the side, it says air raid shelter. So that if you lived out in the middle of Stevensville, Montana, and you were worried about what would be coming from the skies, which is one of the real fears that Pearl Harbor unleashed, was that it wasn't just the fact that it was a devastating attack in Hawaii, where would the next one come? And so here you see an air raid shelter in Stevensville, Montana, getting ready for the attack in case it came to that remote part of the world. This one is, to me, a really compelling one. This is a painting by a Missourian named Thomas Hart Benton. He was so concerned that we weren't quite clear about how awful the reality could be if we lost this war. And so he did a series of paintings. He did 8 paintings in early 1942, late 1941, early 1942. And he called them the Year of Peril. That's where I started thinking about the title. And they're all these really apocalyptic images done with these kind of macabre images, mostly of the Midwest. I used this one in the book actually because it was one of the more sedate images. There were some in which they were so gruesome and so awful. Most of my family and friends said, don't use that one or don't use this one. But this one gets the story across about as well as anything. You can see planes flying overhead. They've done their damage. A woman whose face looks like something out of Munch's The Scream, as seeing her family demolished, her whole world demolished. And so to me, these two images convey the notion of fear and the notion of what William Batt, who was one of the administration figures, said in early 1942, that we have a real chance to lose this war. And this is what could happen if this occurred. So using this as a background, I wanted to try and go over a few things tonight that I hope you'll find particularly interesting. This one, I hope you'll find to be about as interesting if you'll allow me to tell the story. It's hard to get on Google today and not see fact versus fiction about the COVID-19. We are buried underneath a great deal of information, some of it absurd, some of it true. And rumors and false information and misinformation isn't just a recent development. This is the Office of War Information, which was formed in June of 1942. And what it did, it wanted to try and understand what Americans were telling each other, what rumors were floating out there. And here's an office in which some folks are going over some of the rumors that had been collected across the country by rumor reporters. These were people the OWI commissioned to listen in on what people were saying. They worked in salons, they taxi drivers, bartenders. And when they heard of a number of stories, they would report it to their local OWI office that would then report it to Washington, where they would be collated and collected. And the whole notion was, according to the OWI, was to, quote, strike at their root ignorance and to educate the public by getting out in front of these rumors so that the public would be better educated. In his first fireside chat, Franklin Roosevelt said, you've got to be particularly on guard against rumors because they fly fast and furious in a time of war. So in 1942, I got a sense of looking at the rumors that people were telling each other, because how do people relate to each other in 1942? They read newspapers, they read periodicals, but they mostly talk to themselves, or what the OWI referred to as, believe it or not, social networks, and what their neighbors would be saying to each other. And they cataloged these rumors in a variety of ways, and they came up with three major categories. The first one were called anxiety rumors, that people were feeling very anxious about what the future might hold. And I don't think there's any doubt that these anxiety rumors, particularly on the West Coast, played a role in the Executive Order 9066 that Roosevelt signed in February of 1942, interning Japanese Americans, because the rumors were very, very thick about what Japanese Americans were planning to do on the West Coast. Even though nothing happened, General John DeWitt said that's precisely why we need to be worried, because that's how careful they are. So whether they happened or not, that was proof that they existed. Escape rumors was the second category, and that people were feeling some kind of way to escape the fear and the trauma they were feeling by saying that they had heard rumors that the war was going to be over by summer, that Hitler was secretly dead, that no one had seen him for a while, that the Germans were going to surrender within weeks. But by far, the biggest category of rumor, and I was a little shocked to see it, but then once I got into it, and being a historian of the 20th century, I shouldn't have been, but it's what the OWI referred to as hate, particularly racial rumors. Not toward our enemies necessarily, as much as toward Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, Jewish Americans, and most of all, African Americans. Of all the rumors that the OWI had to worry about in 1942, the biggest one concerned something called Eleanor Clubs. These were named after the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. And the notion was pretty simple, that Eleanor Roosevelt was secretly going around the country organizing African-American women to stop working as domestic workers for white families. And these clubs were organized. It cost 10 cents a week to be in them, apparently. And the underlying notion was white people will be making their own dinner by Christmas. Now, when I tell students this, they of course kind of laugh. They think it's absurd that in the middle of a war like this, that we would be concerned with something like that. This will give you an idea of just how seriously some people took this rumor. This is the FBI's own records from Memphis, Tennessee. This is the supposed existence of a Roosevelt Eleanor Club in Jackson, Tennessee. And I hope you can see it on your screen. And it's an investigation based on reports by various informants that African-American women of Jackson, Tennessee were forming a club whose slogan was, quote, not a cook in the kitchen by Christmas. And that FBI agents went out looking for evidence that these clubs existed. Now, the paperwork was pretty strong. They couldn't find them. But the governor of South Carolina was so worried about the existence of these clubs that he had the state police in every single county investigate whether they existed or not. So these clubs, even though they didn't exist, were one of the largest rumors floating around the country in 1942. And they tell us a lot, I think, about race, about fear, and they sound a lot like, if if you go back to the Civil War, about the rumors surrounding a society kind of turned upside down in Reconstruction. I think this is my favorite photo. This is in Life magazine. It was taken by Bernard Hoffman, of an actual rumor clinic that was run by the Boston Herald, a newspaper. Not only was the OWI trying to collect rumors, places like the Reader's Digest, a number of newspapers, but maybe one of the best ones was the Boston Herald, which had reporters go out, find the rumors that were circulating in Boston, report back so that every Sunday they could get out in front of these rumors. You can probably see some of them on the back part of Mr. Gavin's board back there, in which they would publish these rumors and then try to tell the American, their readers that this is not the case, here's what's actually happening. It's the 1942 version of fact versus fiction, I guess you could say. What was interesting to me is that these rumor clinics and the whole OWI effort to get at this misinformation campaign was over by 1943. What a number of researchers found was that the more you try to highlight a rumor and fight it, the more the rumor spread. Even more interesting, what some students at Harvard, I thought I would just give you a notion of what was happening at Harvard. There was another one of the biggest rumors was that Pearl Harbor was a lot worse than what the government's letting on, that it was much more deadly, and Franklin Roosevelt was lying about it. So Roosevelt went on radio in February of 42 to try and discourage those rumors. A number of researchers went to listen to this along with some Harvard students and then asked them about it later. And 20% of the students there said they were more inclined to listen to rumor and what their friends were telling them than what the president was telling them, even after having him try to dispel those rumors at the end of the day. Now, getting back, I wanted to just read one thing for you. One of the rumor mongers who was out in front of this was a minister named Gerald L.K. Smith, a virulent anti-Semite, virulent racist, but he also thought that the government was up to something in World War II that wasn't quite right, and he wasn't buying the whole rubber shortage issue for a minute. He said, quote, "It's common knowledge among all experts, scientists and industrialists, that the rubber shortage is phony." He said, "There's enough rubber right now to recap 100 million new tires without using 1 ounce of new rubber. Instead, what Wall Street monopolies and bureaucratic politicians are after is an imperialistic world empire without tariff walls that will compel American workers to compete with the Chinese coolie, the American farmer, and the Russian peasant." Now, Smith had an idea, by the way, in 1942, to keep America safe from any other foreign invaders. And he said, "What we ought to do is build a hoop of military steel to be constructed all around the border of the United States, the perimeter of the country, and it would guarantee protection against any more foreign wars." Gerald L.K. Smith. Now, I'm going to move ahead to one other thing. There's this notion, I think, that, boy, if we could go, that Congress and politics certainly don't work today in 2020. If we could go back to a previous era when it worked much more smoothly. I don't think people understand that in 1942, politics could be just as dysfunctional as they are today. And I can't come up with a better example than what happened in November of 1942, when a filibuster was launched in the Senate against a bill that you might find odd. In September, the notion was came up before Congress, should we allow soldiers to vote? It seems like a pretty straightforward thing. Who would be against allowing soldiers who are out giving their last full measure in distant lands to vote for their very leaders? That wasn't the issue, though. The opposition that came to the soldier voting notion of soldier voting came about the issue of the poll tax, a tax placed in 8 southern states that would keep African Americans from voting. And if you ended the poll tax just in that one case, would it open a door to allowing more people to vote? The soldier voting bill passed in 1942 in September, but when a larger bill came before Congress in November to end the poll tax entirely, that's when Southern Democrats, Southern conservatives launched a full-blown filibuster. The timing of this, I don't think we can ignore. That is the exact same month in which the first American troops land in North Africa to start the offensive against Hitler's troops and Mussolini's troops. And so you would think that would be the last time that we would be bringing the Senate to a standstill over something like this. But for Southerners, particularly for someone like this individual who is Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi, it was something that struck at the very root of what he held dear, and he was not about to allow the poll tax to go away. If you want to know what they were fighting for in this, I wanted to read just a little part of what Theodore Bilbo had said. He said, if this poll tax bill passes, the next step will be an effort to remove the registration qualifications and then the education qualifications, at which point he said, and he says this on the floor of the Senate, we'll have no way then of preventing Negroes from voting. So if there's one thing they're doing in 1942, there's no code, there's no, hiding behind the issue. They're making it very clear. Now, his fellow senator from Mississippi, Wal Doxey, made it clear that under no circumstances would the South ever relent and allow the poll tax to be demolished. He said, quote, we intend to keep control of our state and see that it always remains under the domination of Anglo-Saxon supremacy. For several days, they launched this full-blown filibuster. It succeeded. The majority leader, Alvin Barkley from my state of Kentucky, finally gave up. And when he left, Theodore Bilbo was asked by reporters about the whole notion of stopping the work of the Senate, even in the midst of what was happening. Here's what he said. He was proud of what he had done, and he said, what I've done here, and let's be clear, what he's talking about is what he had done to kill the whole bill that would eliminate the poll tax and allow African Americans to vote. He said, quote, I'm as much a soldier in the preservation of the American way and American scheme of government as the boys who are dying on Guadalcanal. He actually said that in keeping white supremacy alive and working, even in the midst of our boys dying on the beaches and in Guadalcanal, he was much a soldier in that effort as they were, even if they were dying for it. We'll leave Theodore Bilbo for that. I believe this is my last image for now, and I wanted to kind of end on this and then maybe go to Q&A if that's okay in a few minutes. This is something called Google Ngram, N-O-P, N as in neighbor. It's an interesting search device where what Google Books does is look through all the printed material it has in its library since the mid-1700s, and you can then plug in the name, an event, a theme, a title of something, and see the frequency with which that word or theme or term has been used over the course of the last 200 some years. This is a graph that's showing that one word was used in printed material more in 1942 than in any other year in American history. More than in 1776 or the Civil War, the Depression, not after 9/11, and the word is democracy. And I think that is kind of a clue as to what was really at stake in 1942. And it wasn't just a notion of we're going to gear up and make the tanks and planes and guns, that there was something even greater at risk, and that was democracy. It was a war that asked Americans to sacrifice on so many levels. And that's what I wanted to kind of end with, because Franklin Roosevelt referred to this war as the survival war. There was this notion of what it should be called, and there were many terms. He thought it was the survival war. Two things, and then we can see what you want to talk about after this, but two things I wanted to bring up, and it's about the economy. Americans had to pay more in taxes in 1942 than they had dreamed of beforehand. The upper tax bracket was raised to 88%. And in April of 1942, Franklin Roosevelt went on radio, talked about a 7-point program to try and contain the massive spending that we were going to have to endure, to keep inflation in check, to keep prices and wages and the whole gear of the American economy under control, under really a centralized planning that would be administered by the Roosevelt administration. One of the things that Roosevelt felt adamant about was that no American, he said, who has paid his taxes should make more than $25,000 a year. And that's equivalent to about somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 today. But for Roosevelt, there was this notion that everyone would pay, would have to sacrifice in some level for the ultimate aim, which was winning the war. When he gave that talk, he said, and I just want to read a little piece of this, and then maybe we could go to Q&A afterwards. He says, if you think sacrifice is too great, of what you're going to have to endure, whether it's going to be rations or higher, or your wages are going to be frozen, or prices are going to be frozen, he said, the price is not too high. If you doubt it, ask the workers of France and Norway and the Netherlands, whipped to labor by the lash, whether the stabilization of wages is too great a sacrifice. Ask the farmers of Poland and Denmark and Czechoslovakia, looted of their livestock, starving while their own crops are stolen from their land. Ask them whether parity prices are too great a sacrifice. Ask the businessmen of Europe, whose enterprises have been stolen from their owners, whether the limitation of profits and personal incomes is too great a sacrifice. Ask the women and children whom Hitler is starving whether the rationing of tires or sugar or gasoline is too great a sacrifice. And so that's why, to me, 1942 was a fascinating time to try and understand, because it brought together so many aspects of the 20th century alive to me, but it also made me think about what a crisis looks like, what a society that's undergoing trauma feels. And that's why, like I said when I started a few minutes ago, to be publishing this book at this time is almost eerie for me. And so with that, I'll take that off the screen. If that's okay, Julie, I'll stop the share. Is that okay?
Yes. So thank you. And as you said, there is not a more timely time for this topic. I want to bring up one thing that someone had mentioned in the chat, because you had the image from Dr. Seuss, that Dr. Seuss attended Dartmouth, and the Dartmouth Club is also at the Yale Club. We might have some Dartmouth grads in the audience, so thank you for that.
I didn't mention that it was Dr. Seuss. Of course it is. Dr. Seuss had he probably did 3 or 4 drawings like that a week for PM magazine. And he let everybody have it. I mean, he was an extremely political person. And you can go back and you can look at a lot of these online and see just how political he was. He was very adamant. He was a pro-New Dealer. He was just disgusted by the whole filibuster and the Southern Bloc, and didn't mince words or anything when it came to his drawing. So I left that out. That's my apology. Yes, that is Theodore Geisel, uh, better known as Dr. Seuss.
Great. So we'll open it up for questions from everyone if they wanted to submit it. Again, you can click the chat bubble at the bottom of your screen and type it in, or if you click participants, it'll bring up a window on your right where you can click raise hand to let me know that you have a question, and I'll unmute you. But while you all think of that, I would like to hear, so you mentioned a lot about the anxiety rumors, the escape rumors, the hate rumors, and also that the more you highlight it, the more it spreads.
Yeah.
I always thought that the answer to this was to give more information, to correct the information.
Yeah.
But from what you've seen and what you think, what do you think is the solution to these rumors and misinformation?
Well, I actually taught a course this semester on the history of misinformation. It has been, if I can digress, I've had trouble in class over the last year trying to establish a fact. And I don't know if you know what I mean. I'm like, did Hillary Clinton win the popular vote? Well, no, according to a number of students. 4.5 million illegal immigrants crossed the border into California and voted. So actually, she didn't win the popular vote. And even making the case that California's population is growing since 1970, I had to fight over, because it wouldn't take that long to look up a tweet or something else that said that was not the case. A number of scholars led by two named Allport and Portman, I believe, are the names. I've got them in the book, who spent a lot of time looking at the whole idea of misinformation in 1942. They were very frustrated in that the more they tried to educate the public, the more that they struggled to overcome those rumors. The Eleanor Roosevelt Club rumors grew the harder they tried to tamp them down. They also found that people who are more isolated don't spread rumors as much as those who have social contacts, social networks, and who are more educated. That the more educated can rationalize misinformation and rumors in ways that the uneducated can't. So do I have an easy answer for this? I don't know right now. But I know that the whole idea of misinformation struck at the very idea of a democratic society. And so that's why I thought it was interesting to see the whole efforts of 1942. I wasn't expecting to come up with that to write. As historians, we have enough trouble trying to figure out what happened. So to spend a lot of time looking at the stuff that didn't happen, I thought would be going off the track, but I also thought it might be revealing in ways that in a crisis, this particularly becomes a matter of life and death for a lot of people. So do I have an easy answer? The answer is no right now. I certainly don't think sitting back and just letting the rumor kind of peter out is going to work, but how it's fought is something that we're still trying to deal with.
Speaking of dealing with things, a question from Brian asking, should we be asking Americans to all participate in our recovery and doing something like a victory garden like they did in World War II to overcome the virus?
I think that, why not? I think there is no doubt, particularly when you talk to people who were children in the 40s, that they felt a part of it when you give people something to do. And so the notion of 1942 and throughout the Second World War was not just the soldiers who would be fighting would be sacrificing, everybody would play a role in it. Mm-hmm. My wife and I were watching a movie last night from 1942, and at the end, after it says the end, it came up, the government needs your money, buy war bonds. I mean, can you imagine if someone's out there today saying the government needs your money, they're going to have to go run somewhere. But I think we're seeing it, whether it's in our communities or in our own states or wherever it could be, that the more you give people something to do, I know my students certainly felt like that, the more they feel a part of the answer. If we're all in this together, then we've got to have something to do, whether it's a victory garden, collecting scrap rubber like they did in the 40s, you know. And I think I forgot to mention the whole point of gas rationing was not because we didn't have gas, it was because we didn't have enough rubber, and it was to keep people off the roads. And that generated intense anger by people who had to drive long ways to go to work, or as opposed to people in say the urban areas. So I could see that urban rural anger popping up over a particular policy as well in 1942. I'm trying to grow a victory garden, but the rabbits are causing me. I need some kind of victory antidote to rabbits. But anyway, I'm getting off the point.
But that actually ties in well. We had a statement from Robert saying that he had read that food rationing was intended, at least in part, to have all Americans make some sacrifice so that they have a dog in the fight.
Yeah. I didn't hear the first part of that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying that it was a good tie-in to the statement from Robert saying that he had read that food rationing was intended, at least in part, to have all Americans make some sacrifice.
Right? I mean, the most difficult one, no doubt, was coffee. And I know John Kenneth Galbraith, who was part of the Office of Production, Office of Price Administration, which is a big part of this book to me. And I could talk about that for a second. I'm going to make a quick note of that. Noted that maybe the biggest mistake they made was rationing coffee because it produced the biggest anger and the most vitriolic fights, whether it's in grocery stores or restaurants. And the number of people, the restaurants that were underreporting how much coffee they actually had was one of the biggest problems the OPA had. To me, one of the figures of this book that I wanted to highlight was someone named Leon Henderson, who was, for lack of a better word, a bureaucrat. He was the director of the Office of Price Administration. But no matter what you did, if you're buying something, selling something, if you're a landlord, if you're a renter, it didn't matter. Leon Henderson set the price and would determine just about everything of our lives. I remember reading one little story that he had determined the price of bowling shoes, which you got to think, do people have anything better to do? But there was hardly any aspect of life that Leon Henderson didn't have over. And I found a business card for someone who had once been in something, I'll probably get the wording right, but he was part of the biscuit and pretzel subcommittee of the baking industry of the Office of Management and Budget. In other words, they set the price for biscuits and pretzels. But without that, if you have runaway inflation in 1942, then the whole thing could actually crumble. I mean, and we're talking about spending on a level that we had never seen before. It's almost hard to get one's hands around when you think about the amount of money that we are spending on the war effort, not only in 1942, but then on down the road.
We had a question from Mary asking you if you could please talk about the role of women in the economy and the home front in 1942.
It's absolutely essential. And the role of women is something that I tried to stress, but also in a way that maybe would not be something that would be, when you think of 1942, you think of Rosie the Riveter and that image that everyone knows, it's on every coffee cup. That image came about in 1942, but it was only seen by the people who worked at Westinghouse at the time to try and encourage people to stay on the job. That's what the we can do it, is that we absenteeism is not going to affect us. Millions of women had to go to work. Without them, there would not have been the war production effort. There is no doubt about it. But I wanted to show women in a different light as well. And I took some chances with this book. One of the things, if I could take a few minutes to say, that Yale University Press, I think, is the greatest press in the country. The editors are just first rate, and they allowed me to do some things that I don't know if anyone else would have. What I wanted to do was take the reader month by month to see the tension inside this year, but also the kind of tension that people were feeling in ways that you might not expect. And so I start February off with a case of a woman who was related to Andrew Carnegie. She was a millionaire. Her name was Florence Schnorr. She went to New York one day to go shopping, and her husband sent her off on a train. She goes shopping. She calls him a few hours later. She doesn't feel well. He goes to pick her up. She's obviously in terrible shape. He takes her to the hospital, and she's dead within an hour. And I wanted to try and figure out what had happened to her, and the paper show begins revealing the mystery of what had happened to her was that she had had an abortion that morning, which was illegal. And she went to a place in which the local coroner said had butchered her, and she was dead within a few hours, but she had no other option than to do that. And so the fact that that happened within the same month that Planned Parenthood was created, I found all these ties to kind of show that the life of whether it's, and if I could say, not only are women playing a role in this, there's something I wanted to do with this book, and that's highlight the role of children. Children are usually left out of stories like this, but there are tens of millions of children, and one of the big issues was, what do we tell children about what's happening around? And that's not an easy one as well. Do you tell children about the atrocities that you're reading about in Europe and what could be happening to American service personnel, or do you hide it from them? And one of the people who was at the forefront of this was Margaret Mead, who was asked by the New York Times to try and relate, what should we tell our children? And her mind was, you've got to tell them the truth, that they can handle it. The more it's kind of like with rumors, the more you try and hide something, the more it'll probably discourage them or scare them even more. And so whether it's children or other parts of society that are usually left out of this story, I wanted to try and highlight the experience for them. But going back to your question, the role of women, the role of African-American women in some of these places, I thought was absolutely critical. There was one woman I wanted to mention, and I have her picture in the book as well. Let me see if I can. Her name is Norma Green. She was an African-American woman who was with the US Army. She was a nurse. She had volunteered to serve in Europe. And before she left, she went shopping. She went shopping in Montgomery, Alabama. She got on a bus. Does this sound familiar? She sat on the wrong seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1942 and was beaten a lot by the locals. They called the police. She was beaten pretty savagely and completely forgotten. And this is 13 years before Rosa Parks. But for Norma Green, the fact that she had on a uniform probably was a trigger. It didn't help her. In fact, it probably hurt her to upset the racial mores of the time, to think, how can she be wearing a uniform like that? And for that, she probably suffered an even bigger beating than she would have gotten otherwise.
We had another question from Edward asking, apart from the notorious Japanese American internment camps, were there any general restrictions on freedom of movement that were imposed in 1942 within the United States?
Well, thank you for asking that. We think of the Japanese American internment camps as just simply for Japanese Americans. If you go back and look at Executive Order 9066, Italian Americans and German Americans were not excluded from this. And early in February of 42, General DeWitt and many others thought that they need to be taken away from high population areas as well. But the fact there are so many of them, and particularly the fact that 1942 is an election year, and that if they can vote in November, they will, Italian Americans, German Americans will really come out and punish those politicians who are behind this. The Attorney General Francis Biddle made sure that only Japanese Americans would suffer that kind of fate along the West Coast. But within hours of Pearl Harbor, restaurants in New York would find themselves closed, Japanese restaurants, German restaurants. The kind of civil liberty issues that would be raised, when Fred Korematsu would be arrested in April of 42, are ones that I thought were absolutely essential to trying to understand civil liberties in a time of war, no doubt. I should also add, if there was a fear, in 1942, was that Hitler would somehow launch a series of terrorist strikes against the United States deep within the country, that submarines would release these kinds of terrorists. And I could read throughout early in the year that, there are notions, there are submarines out, outside of Florida or South Carolina or New York that are going to be releasing these terrorists. Well, lo and behold, in the summer, it actually happens. And 4 would be arrested outside of New York, 4 would be arrested in Florida. And the notions are something out of a really bad movie, but they were trained to meet in, of all places, Cincinnati. They had $150,000 in cash, fake Social Security cards, and the whole point was to then go throughout the country and plant bombs and create all the havoc that they could in order to terrorize Americans, in order to restrict freedom as much as they could as well. They were arrested, they were tried, 6 of them were executed and buried in an area outside of Washington, D.C. Fast forward it, many years later, some workers found a little gravestone to these people placed there by the forerunner of the American Nazi Party. And there were fresh flowers and candles placed there in honor of these Abwehr spies and what they could have done. And the year that they finally took the marker down because there were so many flowers on it was 2010. And so I just give you those examples that this book was, it took me about 11 years altogether to do. And it was really hard to get rid of it because it was such, I kept seeing things popping back that were kind of centered in this particular year, but it shouldn't be surprising because as we see, these moments of crises produce kind of a blank slate in a lot of ways. So.
Would there be anything that you would have changed in your book had you been finishing it up after this whole COVID situation?
Oh boy. I really struggled with the conclusion. The conclusion is a 4-page conclusion about democracy. I originally had written like a 30-page conclusion. And it was something along the lines of what would happen if. I'm thankful to the people who talked me out of that because my great if was what happens one day when you go to open up your laptop and there's nothing there. That there is that kind of a strike, by, say, from a nation state against the internet, which still worries me because it's the one thing that's keeping us connected right now, right? But no, I think I would keep it really as where I ended it with. I wasn't sure how to end it, but I ended it with a historian I knew named John Hope Franklin. Some of you might know he was really one of the great African-American historians. And I found this quote of his. And he said, deep within American life, there's been two competing concepts that have been at battle with each other. One tradition, that of democracy and liberalism, has built American civilization, while the other, narrowness and bigotry, has threatened to transform this great American dream into a nightmare. It's a matter of survival to see to it that the best American traditions are not overwhelmed by the worst. And I wrote a 4-word conclusion of that, and that war still rages between these two competing traditions. I'm kind of glad I was finished with this book in January, quite frankly, or else I think I might never have finished it. To be honest with you, I don't know how I would go about finishing it right now.
On a little bit of a tangent, there's a question from Mary asking, many men in America would have already gone into military service in 1942. What was the attitude towards men that could have been soldiers but were still in the US during 1942?
Oh, I think that's a pretty interesting question. There was a great question about, right after Pearl Harbor, there was a great swell of volunteers, obviously. But that didn't do the trick. And a lot of these volunteers were physically not capable of doing military work. I mean, a decade of the Depression had caused a lot of damage. So the notion was, how low do we take the draft age? Do we take it to 18? And that was a really, really tough, and like I said, all this is in the backdrop of an election, off-the-year elections for Congress. And so by the end of the year, after the election, we lower the draft age to 18. But I found it interesting that there were a number of exemptions given, and one of them was to Hollywood. And that the notion of actors play such a crucial role that they should be exempt from this. And a lot of actors said, to heck with it, we're still going. Clark Gable, who actually sat in on some of Roosevelt's fireside chats, he was a friend of Roosevelt's. Roosevelt pleaded with him, don't join the military. He did it anyway. But the one person who absolutely refused to go was John Wayne, who is probably more embellished in the American mind of being the man in the front, going up Iwo Jima and everything else. But he spent the entire war in Hollywood. And people like John Ford, the great director who was actually in various theaters of war, would often make fun of John Wayne and call him less than complimentary names because of this. But millions of Americans could serve, whether they went to the military or worked in some kind of industrial plant. I mean, think about, if there's a big difference between today and 1942, it's what unemployment is doing. Unemployment was at double digits in early 1942. By the end of 1942, it was at 2.8. It reached its all-time low in 1944 at 0.9. So even if you weren't serving in a theater of war, you could go somehow and serve in some way working in a defense plant, whether it's making, tanks and planes and guns, because Roosevelt set such an outrageous amount of production levels in January of 1942, 60,000 planes, so that there was a role still for everyone. And even if you couldn't do that, you could buy a bond. And if you happen to be one of the millionaires who we were worried might, enjoy too much, say, from these military contracts, Roosevelt had an idea of whether it's the top tax bracket of 88% or the $25,000 limit. The tax bracket actually went through. The $25,000 maximum wage, if you want to call it that, did not.
So a question from Edward asking, so pulling together the major themes from the mosaic you assembled, what advice do you have for Americans in the current moment based on what you learned from your immersion in another critical year of peril?
I was afraid someone would ask me that. I would say leadership is important. I would say having a clear, defined message that everyone gets and that there's no confusion. There was no confusion in the war about what our ultimate aim was. How we got there, we could discuss, but everything was built toward winning the war. There wasn't a notion of, do I ration this or not? No, you'll be rationing this, you'll be doing this, and it's all for something greater than yourself. So I'd say leadership matters. I would say that asking people, I mean, the word sacrifice, Roosevelt said he hated to even use the word sacrifice. He thought it was a privilege to be at this moment to do this for future generations. And he was not afraid to say, you're going to be paying more, you're going to not be getting this at the store, you're going to be undergoing hardships, but the whole point is survival. The whole point is something bigger than yourself. I think in looking at this, we've got to realize that whether you like government or not, it's the one thing that has to be there, and there's got to be leadership there that understands that and is willing to work. Congress could work pretty well with Roosevelt and with anyone unless it came to race, as we saw. Then it's not going to happen. Race was the thing that wasn't going to happen. How's that for now?
I think that's great advice.
That misinformation is going to be with us forever. That it was there in leaps and bounds in 1942, and that people were willing, wanted to hear, when they wanted to hear what they wanted to hear, they went with it. When Southern governors heard that these Eleanor clubs were out there, they're going to go after it. Now, the fact that that these were preposterous stories didn't matter. As I wanted to show with that FBI report, a lot of folks took this seriously, and we had a lot of law enforcement going after it. So, I don't know, without being melodramatic, but I guess the moment is the question about how fragile democracy is, how fragile an economy is, and that it's got to be kept together in ways that we've got to remember when times are better, I guess. Mm-hmm. How's and that? So,
that's great. And to maybe end on a little more positive note, do you have any other stories that you've stumbled upon in your research that you wanted to share?
How about some of you, if you can go online and see this, that in order to encourage Americans to pay taxes, who should we get to encourage them other than Donald Duck? And so the Treasury Department paid Walt Disney $80,000 to come up with a cartoon in which Donald Duck, it's called Taxes for the Axis. Then Donald Duck is outraged by what he's been hearing, and so this radio voice comes over and says, well, do you want to do your part? And he says, yes, it's not going to be easy. He goes, I don't care, just tell me. He says, pay your taxes now. And the whole notion is what this would do. Well, when Congress found out that Walt Disney got $80,000 for this, they were absolutely outraged and wanted to cut off any more funding. And Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, said he thought it was well spent because after seeing that film, 30% of the people who saw that were now ready to pay their taxes more so than they had in the first place. How about if I end on a movie that when it came out in 1942, outraged hunters so much that they called for a boycott, and that was this film about a deer named Bambi, that they said was the greatest assault on honest, hardworking Americans they'd ever seen.
That is a very amusing story, and I think a fun place to end. So thank you so much, Professor. This was fascinating. I learned so much, and I feel really lucky to have had you speak on it at such a prevalent time.
Well, thanks for having me, truly. It was an honor, and I hope maybe we can do this under, real circumstances. Yes. But many thanks to you and to Yale and for all of it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Lots more events coming up. Hope to see you at one of them soon. Until then, stay safe, stay home, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.